it might be better to hold and have sort of a panel discussion.
Then we'll proceed with the second presentation. David Hermansen is the director of the preservation program at Ball State, and over the years he has spent a considerable amount of time documenting and studying the history of the small towns in the state of Indiana from an interesting point of view. But I will let him discuss and explain to you his ideas today.
Thank you, George. I'd like to talk about a new look at Main Street, historic Indiana County courthouses, or as I refer to it, Hoosier hysteria of the 19th and the early 20th century. Of Indiana's 92 counties, all built at least 2, and several as many as 6 courthouses in this span of time. Thus, keen competition developed between towns in hope that they would be selected as the county seat, since it was felt that by being selected, this would ensure very rapid growth and prosperity. This was, however, as we'll see, not always going to be the case. These 2 structures epitomize the development of Indiana County courthouses from 1811 to 1936. On the left, the first Wayne County Courthouse, originally constructed at Salisbury in 1811 by William Commons, and now located at Centerville. It's a very fine hewn timber structure. It's the oldest extant courthouse in the Midwest. On the right, the Shelby County Courthouse at Shelbyville. It's an interesting expression of the Art Deco modern mode. And one of the reasons for showing it is that the basic criteria, or one of the basic criteria for listing a building in the National Register, is that it be at least 50 years old and be of architectural significance. Thus, this structure will be 50 years old next year. To back up for a moment, however, and look at 2 ordinances that were passed by Congress in the 1780s that were of primary importance in the development in the orderly system of land and settlement and planning in the Midwest. The Land Ordinance of 1785 was our country's first national land policy. There were 4 basic steps. The government purchased the land from the Indians, the survey of the land by the federal government, the sale of the land, and eventually the settlement. Well, the survey was the key. The land was surveyed and laid out in square congressional townships. And each township was 6 miles by 6 miles square, or 36 square miles. Initially, the minimum purchase was a section, 1 square mile, or 640 acres, at a cost of $1 per acre, cash. Certainly a very modest sum of money now, but then a relatively sizable sum of money and investment. But by 1832, the minimum acreage that could be purchased was reduced to 40 acres, and yet the cost of the land went up to only $1.25 per acre. The survey methodology was the rectangle or the orthogonal grid. The survey disregarded topography, made it easy to locate one's property, and essentially eliminated boundary disputes. Section lines became natural rural roads. Towns were laid out at the junctions by land speculators. The right-angle intersection became the baselines for roads and streets, parallel or perpendicular to the section line of the roads. And this in itself did somewhat promote growth. As John Repp states in Making of Urban America, I quote, "Today as one flies over the last mountain ridges from the east, one sees stretching ahead to the horizon a vast checkerboard of fields and roads, with military precision, modified only on occasion by some severe topographic break or some earlier system of land distribution. This rectangular grid persists to the shores of the Pacific. America thus lives on a giant gridiron imposed on a natural landscape by the early surveyors carrying out the mandate of the Continental Congress expressed in the Land Ordinance of 1785. The second ordinance, the Northwest Ordinance, established the Northwest Territory and was passed by Congress 2 years later, 1787. It established a system of governance, ensured the laws of the original 13 states would be upheld, and the ordinance, of course, became a model for all territories that later entered the Union as states. Indiana's early settlers were native-born Americans. They came from the east middle Atlantic states, particularly New York and Pennsylvania, from the south, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky, the majority coming from the latter two states. From New England and Europe, very few until relatively later, notable exception being the Rappites under the leadership of George Rapp that settled Harmony in 1814. Transportation was the key to the settlement pattern. The Ohio River and its tributaries were amongst the first areas to be settled. In 1816, when Indiana became a state, there were 15 counties, all defined by or penetrated by a major river. By the 1850s, the state had a basic skeletal network of canals, roads, and even a railroad. The wilderness, with its varied topography, was being very rapidly settled. You'll note, for example, in, well, either one of the slides, the notation, 1811, steamboat New Orleans was powered by a Boulton and Watt steam engine that had been brought from Great Britain, then transported across the Alleghenies to Pittsburgh, and then assembled and was the first steamboat to apply the Ohio River and the Ohio Valley area. There were even attempts as early as 1830, a steamboat trying to make its way up the White River to Indianapolis. Believe it or not, it made it, but it got caught on a snag going back, and that was the end, at least, of any attempt to try and navigate that river with anything other than barges. The Ohio River at Hanover, or the Wabash River at now New Harmony, were certainly two of the major spines of the state. It's curious that the spines were at the edges, but then these were going to be the areas that would be settled first. Indiana was about 90% forested. The Pioneer Mother's Forest here at Paoli. Of course, similar forests offered excellent building materials. It's hard to believe, but many of the barges that were floated down with raw materials from the Ohio Valley, the Wabash River, et cetera, to New Orleans were very often made of hardwoods. And then the hardwoods would be sold to be utilized for fine furniture and other interior elements in examples in the South. In the north, of course, the grasslands and the dunes of Lake Michigan. By 1860, all 92 counties were organized, Newton being the last county to be organized in 1860. The county seats and their location are marked on both these maps. On the left, one can see that 1873, for example, marked the relocation of the county government in Indiana, the last from Centerville to Richmond in Wayne County, after considerable strife and debate. The slide on the right shows the physical location of the county seats in their respective counties. And other than those located along rivers, most are centrally located in their respective counties. The concept of the square, the piazza, or the plaza has numerous historical precedents. In Europe, the central open space was often partially defined by a city hall, such as the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, magnificent node that is a major focal point of not only the city, but the surrounding countryside as well. In America, first in the middle Atlantic, southern states, and then in the Midwest, the courthouse was often sited on a square. The courthouse was usually the reason for the establishment of a particular town. And in Indiana, the orthogonal grid became the basis for the plan of the majority of the county seats. Depicted, for example, the Wabash County courthouse on your left, and on your right, the Rush County courthouse. The courthouse became the central node, or the centroid of the town and the county. It was the centroid not only politically, socially, commercially, but architecturally as well, and gave literally an almost indelible footprint in the community. On occasion, land speculators or property owners donated the site for courthouses and then auctioned off or sold the surrounding lots for commercial and residential development. The Temple of Justice, with its very sumptuous detail, became the architectural symbol of the county and usually an expression of civic pride. The courthouse was a multifunctional building, was a place for courts, it was a place for offices, it was a central meeting place. Churches very often held their services in the courthouse until they had time to go ahead and establish or construct a more permanent type of building. Fraternal groups, service groups, all used the county courthouse. And I found that on numerous occasions, even private enterprise was allowed to occupy spaces. A butcher shop, believe it or not, operated in one of the courthouses. Others had barber shops, and others, of course, utilizing the space or extra space very often in the basement, primarily for attorneys. The Wabash County Courthouse, depicted here, continues to dominate the community. The courthouse at Wabash was lighted by carbon arc electric lamps in 1881, and this was the first instance of this being done on a large scale in the United States. Indeed, if you ever have an opportunity to visit the courthouse, one of the carbon arc lamps, the originals, still remains. The bell, or a bell, very often not only signaled the time, the convening of court, and certainly when a verdict was to be handed out. Here are several details of the Washington County Courthouse at Salem. The Union County Courthouse, the tower very often completely dominating the town in the surrounding area. Very often with very rich, very fine detail, 19th century. These details and ability of the craftsmen in the 19th century. These details, in essence, I think, are almost irreplaceable. This, again, the Union County Courthouse. Rivalry between counties was often equally spirited. The interiors, in some instances, have remained almost the same, such as, again, at the Union County Courthouse in Liberty. The Franklin County Courthouse in Brookville. Or details from the Rush County Courthouse on the left, or the Pulaski County Courthouse on the right, both by A.W. Rush and Son architects out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Or the LaPorte County Courthouse in LaPorte by Brentwood S. Tolan, an architect whom I'll mention in a little more detail later. The interiors of the courtroom have been remarkably preserved. We're very fortunate that at least some of the courtrooms have been very well maintained and preserved. Unfortunately, most have been disfigured, usually with acoustical tile ceilings and with some type of a built-in fluorescent lighting system. And the courtrooms were often very copious. Some of them had balconies to be able to hold the swollen, shall we say, numbers of people that arrived to experience the various trials. Several of the examples are quite chaste, but nonetheless, they are still the node or a major node in their respective counties, such as the Ripley County Courthouse on the left or the Scott County Courthouse on the right. Or, equally small, the Martin County Courthouse down at Shoals. Distances, directions, and the methodical numbering of county roads were given with the courthouse as the reference point or as the benchmark. Several types of squares were employed in the planning of the county seats of Indiana and are illustrated here in descending order. The Shelbyville Square, or Insular Square, in other words, a block square, with the streets at right angles to each other and intersecting at the corners of the square, is often referred to as the Shelbyville Square, after the prototype in Shelbyville, Tennessee, dating from about 1811. It was the easiest to lay out and became the favorite parti in Indiana. As can be vividly seen, for example, in Blackford County, the aerial view, for example, of the courthouse at Hartford City, which still continues to completely dominate the community. The Philadelphia, or Lancaster Square, as it's sometimes referred to, or more generally, the biaxial square, is based upon Penn's plan of Philadelphia, laid out on a gridiron pattern with a central square, but with the major streets, as you can see, converging at the midpoints of the sides of the square, and thus giving 4 axial vistas as one approaches the square. In Indiana, there are 3 Philadelphia-type squares. One, the Du Bois County Courthouse, depicted on your right. The other 2, the Orange County Courthouse on your left at Paoli, and the Washington County Courthouse at Salem. The Orange County Courthouse and the Washington County Courthouse being almost immediately adjacent county-wise. And as we'll see, there would be a third one located just immediately to the west. Angola has an open Philadelphia square, but the Divine County Courthouse is sited in the southeast corner of the urban tissue that divines the CBD. The Shelby County Courthouse was sited on the Philadelphia Square initially, but unfortunately was demolished in '36, and the square now functions as a traffic circle parking lot. Hence, I did not even bother to show a slide. The third type of square, the Harrisonburg or axial system, with one street, as one can see, or approach on the axis of the courthouse square, and then the other streets extending at the corners of the square, is named after the Harrisonburg, Virginia square, which was laid out in about 1770. The Johnson County Courthouse, as we'll see in a moment, is a good example, but probably the most outstanding example is depicted on your left, the Vandenberg County Courthouse at Evansville, one of the, I think, most magnificent piles in the state. The Johnson County Courthouse on the left, and the former Lake County Courthouse at Crown Point. The one at Crown Point is on a modification or a variation of the axial system, where the axis is shifted slightly down from intersecting on the main side or a major side of the courthouse square. There are only 5 Hoosier County courthouses that are not sited on a square, and certainly one of the finest is the Wells County Courthouse, depicted here at Bluffton by George W. Bunting and Son. In the 19th century, architecture became a battle of the styles. The first Wayne County Courthouse we have already seen. Wayne County was organized in 1810, and Salisbury, which is no longer extant, was selected as the county seat. It was the first town laid out in the county, which was at that time completely forested. Salisbury was sited just south of US 40, about midway between the present cities of Centerville and Richmond. And the first courthouse of hand-hewn timbers, depicted here, was constructed in 1811. The windows were shuttered and the corner joints were half dovetailed. The same technique or system of construction had been used during the 17th and the 18th century by English colonists to build blockhouses and jails. It proved to be an excellent system of construction, and this structure proved to be certainly one of the most sturdy in the state, having been dismantled and moved on 2 occasions, first to Richmond, where it functioned as a residence, and then in 1952, it was dismantled in Richmond. Interested citizens purchased it at auction, and since the town of Salisbury was no longer extant, it was decided to reconstruct it at Centerville, the county's second seat of justice. It is the oldest extant courthouse in Indiana, indeed the oldest in the Northwest Territory. Most Indiana counties built similar structures. Few of them proved to be as sturdy or as spacious as this one, and all of them have long since disappeared. It was, and still is, I think, a symbol of the frontier spirit and of indigenous construction techniques. The lifespan of the hewn timber courthouses was a short duration, primarily due to the very rapid growth of the population in the state. In 1815, when Indiana was still a territory, its population was about 62,000. By 1860, the population had swollen to over 1,350,000. Masons, carpenters, craftsmen introduced the square or rectangular two-story cube with a hip roof terminated by a cupola, a design concept that would be extensively employed in the construction of scores of more permanent county courthouses in Indiana. The antecedents were numerous, the Georgian and the federal style, and often buildings of this type are referred to as a coffee mill or the coffee mill type. The old state capitol at Corydon, depicted here, was built by Dennis Pennington, completed in 1816, and was originally intended to function as the Harrison County Courthouse. However, the territorial capital was moved from Vincennes to Corydon, and the building served as the state capitol from 1816 to the fall of 1824, when the capital was moved to Indianapolis. The building then served as a county courthouse until 1924, a period of over 100 years. This, in a sense, I think is really quite remarkable when one realizes that all of the other 91 counties in the state were building a sequence. This delightful building was designed and built by Dennis Pennington, an individual whom we know very little about, but with no architectural training, who possibly relied upon handbooks. It was at one time the Speaker of the Territorial House of Representatives. The well-proportioned and nicely detailed building was restored in 1929 and is now operated by the Department of Natural Resources as a state memorial. By about 1850, Indiana had 45 similar county courthouses. Now, only one other remains, the former Perry County Courthouse at Rome. The structure was probably in 1818 on a vast square in anticipation, probably, of very rapid growth. Unfortunately, the population of the county shifted to the west, and the county seat was relocated at Cannelton in 1859. Again, only after a tremendous battle between the citizens of the two towns, armed to the teeth with rifles et al. The building later functioned as an academy, a high school, and an elementary school prior to being closed in 1966. In 1981, it was listed in the National Register, primarily by a local group of citizens, and hopefully the building will be at least maintained, if not restored. One of the most interesting series of Indiana County courthouses are the classically inspired solutions which began to appear in the southern part of the state in the 1840s. The Greek Revival style was to become an American architectural ideal because of our romantic association with ancient Greek arts, politics, and cultural perfection. One of the earliest and now the oldest Greek Revival courthouse in Indiana to be continuously occupied is the Ohio County Courthouse at Rising Sun, depicted here, dating from 1845. The Orange County Courthouse at Paoli is probably the most finely proportioned and outstanding example of Greek Revival architecture as far as courthouses are concerned in Indiana. It was very grandly sited on a gently sloping Philadelphia square defined by low commercial buildings at its perimeter. And although it was damaged by a fire in 1970, this chaste but very finely detailed building was very quickly restored. It also has some very fine ironwork, as you can see the slide on the right. Another interesting example is in the classical vocabulary is the second St. Joseph County Courthouse at South Bend by John Mills Van Osdale. He was the first architect to practice in Chicago and one of the first to practice in the Midwest. Fortunately, when a new courthouse was built in 1898, as depicted on the right, the historic structure was moved and is now used as the headquarters of the Northern Indiana Historical Society, an excellent adaptive reuse of an historic county courthouse. George W. Bunning was one of the most prolific designers of courthouses to reside in Indianapolis. He designed 7 Hoosier examples, and others in Kansas, Michigan, West Virginia, and Tennessee. The latter group in itself, I think, is a testament to his ability to seek out commissions at a great distance from the immediate geographic area of his practice. He was born in Philadelphia, the son of a sea captain, was apprenticed to the shipbuilder's trade, and attended Girard College, which was a very extraordinary institution. In fact, Stephen Girard, in his will, stated that there would be a 20-foot high wall built completely around the grounds. Don't have time to get into the details, but in an attempt to make it more inviting than the Eastern State Penitentiary just down the street, the board decided to go ahead and bury 12 feet of the wall below grade. So it still has a wall, but nonetheless, it's not totally impenetrable. The Montgomery County Courthouse in Clarksville, Tennessee, on the left, is similar to the Johnson County Courthouse in Franklin on the right. And certainly, the Montgomery County example is the precedent. Having been completed in 1879, the Johnson County Courthouse on your right was finished in 1881. During 1983 and 1984, the Johnson County Courthouse underwent an extensive restoration. Concurrently, a low-profile annex was constructed just to the west of Court Street, which in itself I think is a very commendable concept and one that is becoming increasingly prevalent during the state. Incidentally, one of our former students graduated in the first class from the Department of Architecture here at Ball State. George Clinton was responsible for the design of the annex. Well, the complex was dedicated in August of 1984. The Clinton County Courthouse at Frankfort on the left, the Madison County Courthouse on the right at Anderson are more than similar. Both were designed by Bunting, both built during the same years, 1882, 1884, just 70 miles apart. The only difference is the use of materials. Limestone exclusively at Frankfort versus brick and limestone at Anderson. Unfortunately, in 1972, the Madison County Courthouse was demolished. A strong similarity also exists between the Jefferson County Courthouse at Madison, one that many of you probably visited during our conference, or the Indiana Conference on Historic Preservation down at that magnificent city several years ago, and the Switzerland County Courthouse immediately adjacent at Vevey on the right. Both were designed by the same architect, David Dubach of Madison, and as I said, very close to each other, only 25 miles apart. The Madison County Courthouse was the precedent, although both were built from the same set of plans. The Ionic order was employed at Madison, and the Corinthian order being utilized at Vevey. In all probability, from what one can glean from the records in the county courthouse, it was at the contractor's urging that the later example on your right at Vevey, that the Corinthian order should be utilized, being somewhat more sophisticated than the Ionic. And there is a slight modification in the angle of the raking cornice of the Switzerland County solution, a somewhat more accurate use of this classical element. It's quite probable that the State House in Boston, on the left by Charles Bulfinch, was the possible precedent for both solutions. The domes are identical, with the exception of minor details. But the Switzerland County Courthouse has something that its neighbor does not have. a privy classically inspired. The Decatur County Courthouse at Greensburg by Edwin May is certainly one of the most unique of all of Indiana's county courthouses, and certainly one of the most widely known throughout the United States. Edwin May was born in Boston in 1824, moved to Madison in about 1838, a city even then with a very fine, or number of very finely detailed public buildings and residences. Madison was to Indiana in the 19th century what Columbus is in the 20th century, an architectural oasis. He moved to Indianapolis, Edwin May that is, in 1842, and designed 5 county courthouses in the state, plus the present state capitol building. It's an interesting and curious solution, symmetrical in plan, but with a picturesque and rambling silhouette. Very possibly was inspired by the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, which was completed in 1850. Exterior, of course, by James Renwick. In 1903, the exterior, originally of brick, was stuccoed to emulate a more permanent material, stone. In 1973, it was threatened with demolition. An inspection report by Henry Chambers of Akron, Ohio, eminent preservationist, plus public outcry, saved it from destruction. The courthouse was enhanced by entourage, as you can best see in the slide here on the left. But starlings by the hundreds were nesting in the trees. The site was literally a mess. The birds had taken over, almost like the movie The Birds by Alfred Hitchcock. Well, the sheriff ordered the deputies out to shoot the birds. The Department of Natural Resources of the state of Indiana said, no, you can't do that. It's an endangered species. Birds are endangered, but starlings never. Well, the solution, the county commissioners decided there was only one thing to do, cut down all the damn trees. So that's precisely what they did. Then they came back to us a few years later and asked us to prepare a landscape plan, including recommendations on a tree planting program. It's uncertain how the tree took root at the apex of the 115-foot tall tower. Possibly a bird, the wind, maybe Superman carried the seed to the tower. It was first sighted about 1807. The present tree is the 12th in a series of large-toothed aspen that have brought considerable fame and publicity to the building. The local Chamber of Commerce refers to it as the 8th wonder of the world. People have accused the chamber of planting the tree, quote, unquote, possibility. But it has, believe it or not, should be in Ripley, been watered during severe periods of drought. It's water department. And, of course, this caused a local wit to say, it's watered by the springs of the clock. Well, the courthouse has been eulogized on numerous occasions for various reasons. William Jennings Bryan, on a speaking tour in 1908, stated that it was the finest example of Gothic architecture that he had seen in his travels throughout the world. Well, it's not Gothic, but you know, he was obviously trying to win votes. William Allen White, the sage of Emporia, the eminent writer, visited the site, the city, digressed from a trip to the East Coast of New York City to experience it. And he questioned how a tree could grow in stone, whereas on the plains of Kansas, it was difficult to even see a tree grow. To that I can attest, having lived in Kansas for 12 years. The Hamilton County Courthouse at Noblesville, also by Edwin May, very sharp contrast to his Decatur County Courthouse, shown here pre-restoration and post-restoration, pre on the left, obviously. An excellent example of the Italianate style, the Morgan County Courthouse at Martinsville by Isaac Hodson. The exterior was restored and the interior renovated, and a very sympathetic addition was added by Rawle McLaughlin of James Associates in the late 1970s. The Bartholomew County Courthouse at Columbus, also by Hodge, a very interesting expression, variation of the Second Empire style, but a very personal one. And I think this was one of the real keys with regard to so many of the examples that were built in Indiana. Furthermore, it's somewhat unique in that the facade is really aligned with the facades of the adjacent urban tissue or fabric, although it's built the county courthouse or square. The former Vandenberg County Courthouse at Evansville, which now functions as the Conrad Baker Center, is a superb statement of the Beaux-Arts style. It has few rivals, I think, in richness in the Midwest. And very often we think of the Columbian Exposition in Chicago of 1893 of being the springboard with regard to the exploitation of the Beaux-Arts style, but here is a very fine example that had been completed 2 years prior to the complex in Chicago. Another excellent example of adaptive reuse, and certainly just magnificently detailed, as is the Allen County Courthouse at Fort Wayne by Brentwood S. Tolan, another very fine turn-of-the-century expression of the Beaux-Arts classicism. The interiors, I think, are amongst the finest in the state. They're as sumptuous in richness and size and scale as one can experience in many state capitals. Several 20th century examples are worthy of mention. Monroe County Courthouse at Bloomington was restored in 1984, and a temporary annex is being used until a new courts building is completed. The interiors have been totally revitalized and taken back to their original luster. The DeKalb County Courthouse at Auburn by Mahurin and Mahurin, the same architectural firm, has been impeccably maintained over the years and has required only minor modifications since its completion in 1914. And this word maintenance, I think, is really the key. For if the buildings, for the most part, are properly maintained, we wouldn't have to worry about even the utilization of the word restoration. But very nicely detailed, very fine art glass. The Jay County Courthouse at Portland, a very simple exterior, certainly with a very fine interior stairway. The courtroom is as it was built in 1918. And as I said, the complex, like many others, I think exudes the pride of the community. The Howard County Courthouse at Kokomo on the left is a restrained Art Deco modern solution. When additional facilities were needed, the former post office on the right by James Knox Taylor was adaptively reused to function as the Howard County Government Building. The interiors of the courthouse, quite simple, but again, fortunately, have been very well maintained, as have the interiors depicted here of the Shelby County Courthouse in Shelbyville, indicative of the more restrained and less opulent detailing that was so prevalent in the 1930s. In conclusion, the works of two additional architects are worthy of mention. Thomas J. Tolan and his son Brentwood S. Tolan. In 1874, Thomas J. Tolan moved his family from Ohio to Fort Wayne and established the firm of Thomas J. Tolan and Son Architects. Upon the death of his father in 1883, the name of the firm was changed to Brentwood S. Tolan Architect. They designed 10 Midwest County courthouses, 8 in Indiana and 1 each in Ohio and Illinois. The Van Wert County Courthouse at Van Wert, Ohio, was designed by the elder Tolan. Of that we can be almost certain, since his son Brentwood was only 19 years of age when construction commenced in 1874. This fine Temple of Justice was completed 2 years later in 1876. They, the Tolans, became the masters of the Second Empire style and the Victorian mode of ornament, not only here in Indiana, but in the Midwest as well. The Park County Courthouse by the elder Tolan at Rockville on the left laid the foundation for the design of the County Courthouse at Warsaw on your left by Thomas J. Tolan, and the at Warsaw House at Muncie on the right by Thomas J. Tolan, and the third Delaware County Courthouse at Muncie on the right by his son Brentwood S. Tolan. Both of them are similar in massing and detail. The window details, the inn pavilions are almost identical, as are the domes. The interiors of the Kosciuszko County Temple of Justice have been well maintained. The typical view of the stairway, hall, view into the dome. And the courtroom is really quite magnificent, except for the modern lighting fixtures. The ceiling, gilding, precise, fine. Unfortunately, the Delaware County Courthouse was demolished in 1966. To me, a tragic loss. And in a sense, I've probably mentioned it far too often, and people are tired of hearing it. But of greater importance is what we have. 60 19th century county courthouses depicted by the squares in the map on the right, and 29 20th century historic courthouses that, in other words, are 50 years old or will be 50 years old within the next year. Only 8 counties, shown in yellow, do not have an historic courthouse. Indiana still has one of the finest assemblages of historic county courthouses in the Midwest. And I think they vividly express a rich variety of architectural concepts and afford us with a fine architectural experience. They are our nodes. They are our architectural heritage. They are the footprints of Main Street. Thank you.